manage pests. Wildlife Control Consultant, LLC, Pest Geek Podcast, Living the Wildlife Podcast, Stephen M. Vantassel, or their or his affiliates are not responsible for followers' use of the information provided here. Hi everyone, Stephen Vantassel here, Wildlife Control Consultant, bringing you another episode of Living the Wildlife as part of the Pest Geek podcast system. I will definitely get that down today. So hey, I hope you had a great week. Here we are moving closer and closer into the colder weather in the fall. Fall is probably my favorite season of the year. I don't get as much of the fall here in Montana as I would back in New England, but certainly I do enjoy the little bit cooler weather, especially at night with a somewhat warm days and cool nights. Is certainly my preference. And then of course we've had some rain to reduce some of the fire risk out here. We've been in certainly some dry conditions out here in the west. But anyways, I hope your week went well, and we are doing another edition here of our Living the Wildlife podcast. So do take a few moments, if you would, to subscribe to the channel, sort of ring the bell. Make sure you're getting all the latest podcasts here. And of course, you can always reach out to me. Email is preferred, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. You can also join us on Facebook with our Facebook family. You can reach us there at the Pest Geek Podcast family there with our groups, and there you can talk about your triumphs and your trials, and of course asking questions there as well. I post there occasionally, but certainly if there are questions, that's one place to do. I am looking for people to ask questions, of course, for our podcast. You can again reach me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Some people have asked about getting consulting services. I do consulting services, but if you contact me, I do charge. Those who are blessed to be in Montana, I cannot charge there because it would be a conflict of interest with my job. So I would just encourage you to call me at my day job, and happy to chat to your heart's content. But those outside the state, well, there's going to be a charge for that with the Wildlife Control Consultant. So I hope that makes sense. My life is complicated if you haven't figured that out already. However, those of you that don't want to necessarily pay, you can certainly send questions in, and if I talk about them on the podcast, you obviously get the information for free, and so it allows me to talk more generally, but certainly there's going to be some principles that may help you in your particular business. Of course, one thing you want to always remember is that we have a whole list. I've been doing this for about 4 years now, so there is a wealth of information out there. Just do a little bit of searching and you will be shocked at how much information you will find. My particular website here, if you just go to the training section, just click that, and you can go down to Living the Wildlife shows, and you can see a listing of the shows here, and I'll keep adding to it as time goes on. But you can just simply do a right click, or actually a Control F, and just type in the word, let's put in the word bat. Lo and behold, bat occurs 3 times on this particular page, and so it may be a topic that's already been covered. I try not to go over material that I've already covered in the past, but sometimes I will readdress certain things there. And but nevertheless, you by all means can reach me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. All right, well, let's get on with the topic at hand today. So today I wanted to continue the conversation that I had on porcupines. Last time I talked about porcupine, we'll call that part 1. I talked about their life history and biology. And so let's get up here to the section on porcupines. So, all right, we talked about quill removal last time, and so we're going to be moving into some other elements of their behavior, and then getting into the damage portion of this particular species, so their damage identification, what they do, and depending on the time that we have, I may get into some of the control methods for this particular species. So we'll see how it plays out. All right, so if you're looking for life history, reproduction issues, that will be on the previous podcast on porcupines. I'm going to call that Porcupine Part 1. In this particular section, we're going to be dealing with issues of primarily their damage and damage identification for porcupines. In other words, what are they doing that makes people so mad? And we will talk about that here. All right, so porcupines, in terms of their winter movement behavior, and the reality is most of your porcupine work typically is going to be called for in the winter time or in the cooler months. Now, could it occur at other times of the year? Absolutely. But a lot of the research on porcupines is simply done during the winter because that's when a lot of the tree damage occurs. And for many people, that's why they're going to be calling you. In other words, the porcupines are a little bit food stressed. Why? Because they're the what's called herbaceous foods, the grasses, the bushes, the shrubs. They're not green anymore, right? So this is a problem because the porcupine feeds on that. And so when you're food stressed, you have to go to other sources of food, of which the tree is going to be the primary source, and they will strip off the outer bark to get to that inner green cambium layer with all those nutrients there, and that's where they do their damage, and it can sometimes girdle the tree. Oftentimes it just creates these wounds in the tree and then exposes the tree, of course, to larger elements of infection and pest predation and this sort of thing. And so it scars the tree, and it can impact its viability or worth for the lumber industry. So you have aesthetic reasons why people hate porcupines, and then of course you have production reasons for people that are in forestry and trying to produce logs that are going to be marketable for the lumber industry and a variety of other things. So porcupines can become a significant issue. But it's their damage during the wintertime that certainly is going to be encouraging some research in that particular area. What are they doing in the wintertime? Well, a Minnesota study found that porcupines tended to move the most when wind speeds were less than 3 miles an hour. Now, you may say, well, Stephen, why do I care about this particular piece of information? What it means is that when you're doing some wildlife control on porcupines, and you know that the weather is going to be just downright awful, maybe some high winds and this sort of thing, then understand that maybe that's not the time to set your traps. Maybe you want to maybe push it off a day. Tell the client, hey, you know that high winds are not the time. Porcupines tend not to move during high winds. Can I come the next day, and maybe the winds will be a little smaller? Now, you know, you run your business the way you want, right? But I'm trying to tell you why some of this scientific information can be helpful to help you target, because wildlife control is such a time-intensive endeavor. Anything you can do to help reduce your windshield time and time just checking empty traps, all the better. It increases your efficiency, which therefore I would trust would increase your profitability and customer satisfaction, and which is really what you want to do to help the viability of your business down the road. Another element of what expanded porcupine, because they're not great movers, right? I mean, they're not like a long-legged coyote that can move miles and miles in a day. Porcupines are kind of clumsy, right? So they don't walk that great, and so they kind of shuffle along, and it's kind of painful, you know, in terms of the slowness here, right? So they're not going to be high mobile animals, and so it makes perfect sense to understand that if the snow has a crust layer on it, especially if you have deep snow, all the better, because now the porcupine doesn't have to trod its way through snow, and so it can just simply kind of walk across the top of that crust, and that would also increase its mobility. So that makes perfect sense, but we may not have thought of it unless the researcher discovered this sort of information, right? So sometimes you just know things intuitively. You're like, oh yeah, that makes perfect sense, but you didn't know that you knew it. until someone came along and made this sort of observation. And so this could be rather powerful information, particularly for those of you in the colder parts of the United States and up into Canada, where this type of information may be quite helpful for you in terms of increasing the efficiency of your porcupine control methods. All right, so let's take a look at the damage that they do. Okay, so here we have a couple of pictures. Notice the tree branches here have been stripped pretty well. And there you have a bark area that's also been stripped by porcupines. And so typically, as a rule, porcupines like to gnaw on trees when they have something to sit on or lay on. So you want to be looking at the tree branches and say, okay, where is this damage occurring? Because the porcupine doesn't want to have to keep clinging to the tree while it's gnawing away at it. It wants to relax, and why expend the energy, right? So it's going to be just, animals are lazy. That's an important thing for us to realize. And animals really aren't in necessarily great shape. They're actually quite lazy, right? Because why would you want to expend the energy if you don't have to, right? Nature's cruel. Nature's hard. Finding food is difficult, and so you wouldn't want to do that. So here you have situations where porcupine can just simply lay on those horizontal branches that you saw there and just gnaw away to its heart's delight. You're also going to be looking for trees where they strip off the outer bark, because there's not really any nutrition there in the outer bark. That's the protective layer of a tree. They want to get down to that green inner cambium layer where all the nutrients are in that particular tree. So you will often find strips of bark, chunks of them, and then of course scat below the area where the porcupine has been working. So that can be helpful if you're trying to assess a particular area, and if you look carefully, you might even see one. And if you're allowed to shooting would be certainly an opportunity for you to remove that problem porcupine just by shooting it. What types of trees do porcupines select? Is there preferences? And the answer is yes. Now we want to make sure we're clear about this. Just because an animal has a preference doesn't mean it won't damage trees outside of the preference, right? So, for example, it may be your preference to always ride in a Mercedes-Benz, but you will go into a Volkswagen, right? So the same way with a porcupine, that if a porcupine has the option, it would typically go toward these types of trees, but those options aren't always available, right? So it's going to go to whatever is going to provide it some nutrients at that particular time. So when we talk about these are principles, they're not laws. They're not things like the law of gravity. These are things that are generalities that push comes to shove. Don't be shocked if the porcupine's choosing this tree over another. That can be helpful in terms of trapping. If you're being told to ask, if someone's asking you how can I protect trees, which trees should I be looking to protect? Because can you protect all of them? That may not be practical, right? So you'd want to be looking at these characteristics. What are those characteristics? They tend to prefer larger trees, and they have something called diameter at breast height. So that means you stand up to a tree and you stand next to it, and the width or the diameter of the tree at your chest, what they call breast height, you would take your tape measure and measure the tree that way, and that's what the diameter of the tree would be. And what they found was that trees typically 6 to 10 inches wide in this particular study. I believe this Southwest Alberta study was done in some forestry land, so a lot of the trees would have similar sizes, but nevertheless they found that larger trees were picked more frequently in a statistically significant way than smaller trees. Does that mean they'll never touch a smaller tree? No, it just means that they tend to go for those larger trees. And there was some indication, and as I recall in my reading, that there are certain size trees when they just didn't want to climb. It was suspected that they were just too big. So if you have these monster trees, it's too hard, I guess, for the porcupine to climb. and they don't like to do it. So they tend to have that larger trees, but not monster trees, if that helps. Trees with open crowns. The crown is the top portion of the tree, and they like them when they're a little bit open. They like to often girdle and do their gnawing at the upper reaches of the tree. And why is that? Because that's where the growth is. The bark isn't as thick. So why would a porcupine want to gnaw at lower levels when the bark is thicker, older? Now they have to chow through all that before they even get to the Cambrian layer. So the same reason why they go out to the tips of the branches, why the bark is not as thick, and they can still get to the nutritious area there faster. So those are some characteristics. A last characteristic, faster growing trees. Now, it's hard for us to identify faster growing trees, right? But what the researchers thought was that the faster growing trees just simply had more nutrition. And therefore, the porcupines seemed to select those out. Porcupines have incredible noses. They can't see all that great, but they have an incredible nose. And so perhaps they're able to somehow sense, maybe by the smell of the tree, that certain trees are able to grow faster than others. Who knows what goes through the brain of a porcupine? Are there certain trees that are preferred in terms of species? And the answer is yes. Just like you have your favorite foods, porcupines have their favorite foods. And I tried to pick a variety of that were situated across North America to kind of help those of you, because I'm sure we have a pretty broad audience here, and I wanted to be sure that various parts of the country were covered. So even if you don't have trees like this in your particular area, chances are one or two of these will be from your area. But understand, preferred doesn't mean exclusive, right? They're not exclusive eaters of these trees. They will eat others, but if they have a choice, they would tend to choose these. So let me list them for you for those of you who aren't able to watch the slide. Here it's hemlock, sugar maple, elm, white cedar, basswood, ponderosa pine, northern white pine, balsam fir. Let me read those again for you. So these are the preferred species of porcupines: hemlock, sugar maple, elm, white cedar, basswood, ponderosa pine, northern white pine, balsam fir. Now there are others, and so this list isn't necessarily complete, but understand that don't be shocked if a porcupine's damaging a tree that's not in this list. Okay, so, but this will give you an idea of some of those top trees that they would really like to hit, and that can be another clue for you that you're dealing with porcupines in this particular area. What are some characteristics of the tree damage? I already mentioned some of those characteristics, but as I said before, porcupines like to damage portions of the tree where they can rest. So if there's a horizontal branch that they can just sort of sit on or lay on, then they can sort of gnaw away to their heart's delight. And that makes perfect sense. Why work if you don't have to? It's better to sit down and eat rather than stand and eat, right? It takes less energy. How much of an area do they typically damage? So the average area damaged on a tree, and again, average doesn't mean exclusive. It just means that they took a whole bunch of measurements on trees and had an average element of what damage. So some trees were damaged less, some trees were damaged more, and sometimes significantly more. So it just gives you an idea of how much area they would simply consume. And what they found was about 101 square inches, and that's a lot. So think of it as a 10 by 10 area, 10 inch by 10 inch area. You could have a 5 inch by 20 inch area. So you got to get that kind of that in your head and recognizing the area that's damaged. In other words, this is the part that's been stripped of its bark down to the inner wood. Can be 101 square inches on average in terms of what the porcupine is damaging there. How do we identify the difference between squirrel damage and porcupine damage? Well, The key to look at is terms of the tooth marks. So you'd have to measure your tooth marks. You are carrying a ruler with you, right? So one of the things that I like to do is I carry, I'm kind of a Leatherman guy, but on the Leatherman wave that I have here, I think that's, excuse me, Surge, not wave, there is some measurement markings on the handle. And so choose a multi-tool that has measurements on it. That way it allows you to be more precise. And if you can get one that includes millimeters, all the better, because a lot of scientific literature, of course, is written out into millimeters. And also millimeters is much more precise when we're dealing with some of those smaller measurements that we're going to see here. Certainly when we're measuring tooth marks, okay? You may also see some relationship in terms of how the wood is scored. Let me think I can go back to the previous one. You'll notice you may get this sort of herringbone stripping of the bark, or scrapings, where it's scraping this way on the bark and then scraping this way, so it creates this herringbone. It's called a herringbone type image, and you may see that on the branches and trunk as well. Of course, binoculars are going to be important, because I doubt many of us are wanting to climb the tree, but you may see some branches that may have been gnawed up, and you might be able to find some elements from there. But you know, you have to kind of try to gather all the evidence that you can to make sure you're not dealing with squirrel damage. But just a reminder, typically you're looking at porcupine tooth damage is going to be twice the width as that of a squirrel. So that can be helpful. Think of it like mice, you know, rat gnawing is about twice the size, twice the width of mouse gnawing. And so that can be quite helpful for you. Do porcupines consume other food sources? And the answer is yes, they do. They don't just simply attack trees. They've also been known, this was sort of a surprise to me, they also attack grain fields, and they will go after gardens, particularly those with succulent plants, and then of course orchards, looking for those fruits, those sugars in there. And those can be quite damaging. I was not aware of this. This is sort of news to me. I guess I would love to get some reports from people, if they care to share that with me. Did they have any contact with producers that have suffered damage in crop areas and orchards from porcupines? I would be quite interested in this. Or maybe it's just so minor that it's hard to identify because of the deer, maybe some woodchucks or squirrels or raccoons. Maybe the porcupine damage gets lost in the damage from those other species. I don't know, but I would certainly be intrigued. And I think it's important for us as professionals to sort of keep an open mind. One of my favorite quotes is from Johnny Cochran, who's defending O.J. Simpson's, and we have to be careful. We have to avoid the rush to judgment, right? So what else would a defense attorney type say, right? So the same way with us is we have to be careful that we just don't get into a rut and we're not able to see evidence that maybe conflicts with our preconceived ideas on what the problem is. So just understand that porcupines can attack grain, gardens, and orchards, and so definitely keep that in mind. Do porcupines have any diseases? And the answer is yes, they do. They're not a significant threat for humans. Why? Because humans tend not to be using them as pets. We don't have a lot of interactions with them, right? It's not like raccoons and dogs and cats where we have a much higher interaction with. Porcupines are like skunks, right? Skunks can carry certain diseases, but typically we're not looking to have a close relationship with a skunk for obvious reasons. But porcupines do carry a bunch of diseases, including worms that are inside of their body. But one publication I found said that they were doing this sort of necropsy on a wild caught porcupine, and what they found was that it had Balis ascaris worm inside of its brain. Now that's known as larva migrans, and if that word Balis ascaris kind of rings a bell, you know that Balis ascaris procyon is the roundworm of the raccoon. Procyon is one of the scientific names for the word raccoon. Balis ascaris means roundworm. Okay, so it's a type of roundworm. So, but unfortunately, the researchers were unable to identify it down to its specific species. They didn't have enough DNA to make that determination. So it could be Balasiscarus procyonis, or it could be Balasiscarus columnaris, or Balasiscarus mellis. I'm not familiar with Balasiscarus columnaris or Balasiscarus mellis. So they were thinking it's got to be one of those three, and they found it in its brain. So here we have an indication. So this is something I just wanted to mention. We tend to focus so much on raccoon roundworm, as well we should. Okay, I'm not diminishing that because raccoons are the definitive host. But I just want this as a reminder to those in the audience that other animals can carry Balasiscarus procyonis other than the raccoon. And to the extent that they can shed the eggs in situations, it means that when I give my talks, I remind people, poo is bad, don't touch that, right? So sometimes in our industry, we can become a little cavalier, too familiar, and we're not wearing gloves as we should be. We're not washing our hands as we should be. And we might be doing some things that are just a little bit, we're in a hurry. Maybe the next client is yelling at us and we're just cutting corners. And we have to be careful because we might get bit by a disease that we could have easily have protected ourselves from. So I just want this as a reminder, keep your wits about you while you're out in the field and understand that some of these diseases that we associate with more common animals like raccoons and skunks and things can infect other species as well. Wildlife is dangerous. I'm not, there's not plutonium. I'm not trying to suggest that the case, but we have to be careful and always cognizant that animal is dirty, and it means that we need to be sure that we protect ourselves and loved ones and clients appropriately so that we don't make a silly, unnecessary mistake. All right, so keep that definitely in mind. All right, well, that's enough of our talk on porcupine damage and disease and some of their dietary behaviors. And I hope you found that interesting. Again, you've been listening to Living the Wildlife. Do take a few moments, if you would, subscribe to our channel. I would love to hear from you, from some thoughts. I'm looking for individuals who are interested in being interviewed for the show. You can reach me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. That's wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Would love to hear your thoughts, even criticisms of the show. If you have ideas for future topics, and I would definitely love to hear that as well. Do join us on our Facebook group page at the Pest Geek Podcast on Facebook. Tell us about your trials and triumphs and give a place to get some camaraderie and fellowship there on Facebook. And then, of course, you can always reach me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. I am still looking for some Norway rat scat. If you have some, I would love to talk to you. I'm looking to purchase it. I pay $20 for the scat, and I will pay you $10 for the shipping. I need at least 20 samples. So I would encourage you just to dry them. Typically they'll be dry when you find them. I want some dry ones. You can just put them in some Ziploc bags and drop them into a prepaid priority mail envelope. I mean, make sure you contact me first to make sure that I'm like, someone else hasn't sent them in that I've already ordered got some from them. And of course, I usually just pay you by PayPal. I'm also looking for damage photos. I do buy the use rights of photos. I don't buy ownership rights of the photos. I buy use rights of the photos. So you probably have a pile of photos on your computer just taking up room and not making you any money because you're not using them. I also organize photos and I can watermark them for you. We can certainly do that type of consultation services for you as well. And of course, I'm looking to purchase use rights of photos, and you can make some money doing that as well. So definitely, as the winter months are coming in, some of you are slowing down. Maybe you're looking to raise some money for Christmas or something. Definitely reach out to me. And how do you do that? wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Well, thanks for watching. Thanks for being part of the show. You've been listening to Living the Wildlife. Why? Because we want you to live the wildlife. not be the wildlife. Take care, everyone.